Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm really pleased to see how many finance people are here. And what I hope in the process is that we can learn a lot from you. Neither Gaby or I are finance people. We sort of managers and directors. So we don't necessarily have the accounting skills, etc. But we are accountable for the money. And that means we have to be sure that proper systems are in place so that we can account to whether it's government when we send our audited financial reports to the NPO Directorate, to our board, to our donors, and also to our beneficiaries about how money we've raised has been spent. So, when I think back about setting up Inyathelo and what was important for us when it came to financial management, we didn't have much budget, so we weren't too worried about long-term planning, etc. I was more worried about the paper trail. And having a proper paper trail where you can account for who's decided to spend the money, that it's been approved, usually with 2 signatures, that payment has been made on time, and that you reconcile your bank account with your expenses every month is very important. And for us, that was one of the first things that we have to learn. For those of you who kind of work with a lot of people and have to assist with things like taxi fares and other payments for your beneficiaries, you have to have a paper trail that shows that money's been handed over, that there are receipts, you're clear about what the money was for, etc. So for me, when we started in Inyathelo, it was the absolute basic. Can we account for the money? So when it comes to paper trails, if you think there are any gaps there, have a good look again. And there's some very good people who can assist with putting those systems in place. We then had to look at budget. And when we started again, actually it was Gaby and myself back in 2002, who decided to look at a 5-year budget for Inyathelo when we didn't really exist. And we sat down and counted for everything that we could imagine, from the kettle in the kitchen to what stationery we might want, to what kind of table we might want, what kind of salaries we wanted to pay everybody. And we slugged it out. We did not thumbsuck. We actually got quotes for everything. We assessed what everybody else was earning. And we were very clear what was going to go into that budget. And what has been interesting ever since then is our budgets are pretty accurate. We've never actually had to use a line item which says contingency, because we've actually accounted for what we need. But the big thing about a budget, and this is what our auditor told us, it's not something cast in stone. It's a tool for an organization, and you have to make it work for you. So when I talk about budget, we talk about estimate. And you might find that you overspend in one line item and you might underspend in another. And that kind of little up and down is not a crisis. You needn't say rigidly, you've got 10,000 Rand for that and you may never go over it. If it's important for the organization and you spend 11,000 for that line item, you have to look where it's going to come off somewhere else. But it doesn't mean once you're stuck there, you can't manipulate that budget a bit. I'm not saying over manipulate, overspend, but it's a tool. And I think keep that in mind. It's very important. For us as well, one of the big issues is the issue of watching organizations that come to our clinic trying to deal with something they call core costs or overheads, which seems to be separate from their project costs. So what goes into core costs? People put in things like salaries, rent, electricity and water, stationery, maintenance, all those kind of things. And then they have their project costs or their program costs. So if you're running a program, let's say a feeding scheme, you'll have in there the food, the pots and pans, the transport for the food, the staff that work in the feeding scheme. But you won't necessarily include your finance manager or your executive director. And that is a basic error in financial planning. because it's extremely hard to raise money for core costs.
Yeah.
It doesn't achieve anything. You can't say, this is the impact of the core costs, where you can say, this is the impact of the intervention we are making in society. So at Inyathelo, and for all the people who come to our clinic, we explain very carefully, there is a principled position. Every project or program has to pay its way in the organization. So every project and program has to make a contribution to what we call core costs. So when you budget for your program, let's say your feeding scheme, you put your director, a portion of your director's salary in that for the amount of time they will spend on that project. You will put your finance person's salary in that. You will put your receptionist's salary into that. So that project has to cover your overheads. You put in a portion of your rent, your maintenance, your communications, and don't forget some of the critical things like your governance. It costs money to have board meetings. It costs money to produce an annual report, which is part of good governance because you're reporting back. And it costs money for your audited financial reports, which are part of good governance. So you can even put a line item which says governance. Now, you may have a donor who says, we don't do core costs. Then you have to ask yourself the question, are we going to accept this money and take the hit? And that's a strategic question. Or does it mean we can't do this project until we found a second donor? But if you take money and you really can't pay for the project, including the core costs, then you're taking a big risk because in the end, you're going to crash. And I think there are more and more donors now who understand the importance of investing in organizations and not just their projects.
Yeah.
So I'm going to also mention at this point the 10% admin, because there are a lot of donors who say, well, your core costs come out of the 10% admin. And I once said to a donor, well, who invented 10%? Because mine cost much more than that. And I actually don't know where 10% has come from. It's just a stupid tradition. And the important thing is to look at really your admin in some ways could be your contingency. It's your undesignated money. It should be available to put in all those little places that need filling up subsequently. So don't get pushed off with a story about your 10% covers your core costs. Absolutely not. Most staffing comes to at least 30-35% of an organization's bill. And you cannot squash that into 10%. So if you have donors who come with that, you don't have to be rude, but certainly engage with them and say, you know, that kind of thinking has gone out with it's very old thinking, and that we recognize the importance of organizations just to exist, not only to deliver the programs. The other key thing about financial management is ensuring you have a diversity of donors. In other words, different kinds of donors and a number of donors so that you're not dependent on one. And they can be international foundations, they can be local foundations, and there are lots of them which you can find on our funding finder. They can be corporate donors, you might get some money from government, but it needs to be diverse. Because the minute one stops funding you, and they go through funding cycles, they change their focus areas, you aren't just dependent on one and you've got others to fall back on. And the important thing about all your donors is to have very, very strong relationships. So when they do make that grant, make sure you thank them, that you keep them informed, that you report on time, because you want to keep those donors. And giving them a great experience and making them feel as though they're part of your organization will mean they'll keep on giving, but even when you're in a crisis, you can contact them and say, is there any chance of bridging funds for the next 3 months, because our next donation from somewhere else is only coming then. And you might find there's a lot of give and take. So keep your relationships good. Remember, thanking, keeping them informed is good financial management. Besides the diversity of donors, one also needs to look at a diverse income stream. So yes, donor funding is one income stream. And in time, you might want to start looking at two other areas. The one is, can I do programs that I can contract out? So for example, if you're doing youth development, is there a way of working with the Department of Education, the Department of Social Development, or wherever, to offer training to youth in the field that you know, and to put together some kind of program which you can offer for a fee? Because that kind of income is fee income, and again, it's a set amount for a service. That money comes in as a fee, which means you can use it eventually however you want. It's just straight income, earned income. The other kind of income generation that people are looking at, and I really have mixed feelings about this, is setting up a business which is owned by the organization, and then the profit from that business coming into the organization. And people are playing with this. There are tax issues around this. Non-profits cannot just set up businesses. SARS looks very carefully at your income. And if they see there's a lot of income coming in that is earned and is not donor money, they're going to ask, how did you make this income? And if the income is not strictly aligned with the objectives of your organization, they are going to say, you're running a business in competition with for-profits. You have a business which is tax exempt, which gives you an unfair advantage. And they will cancel your tax exempt status. So I'll give you a little example that Inyathelo is looking at. Next year, we will have moved into what we're going to call a civil society hub. This little resource center is going to be a very big one. And in there, we will have conferencing facilities, which we will also loan out as an income stream. If we generate too much money from the conferencing facilities, government is going to come to us and say, Inyathelo, conferencing is not your core business. Your core business is strengthening civil society. You are running a business, and therefore we're going to take away your tax exemption. So we have to set up a for-profit company owned by Inyathelo. We will have to pay tax on that income in order to generate income for ourselves. What's happened to some organizations who've set up an alternative business, even though it's a for-profit, they've gone into mission drift. They've been so focused on that business running, they forgot their original objectives. And many people in our non-profit sector are not business people. We don't really have the skills to do that. So some of those businesses fail as well, and we have invested our non-profit money into a business which has failed. So be very, very careful about going where you don't have the skills and where you go into mission drift. Okay. And then the last thing which Gaby is going to talk about is the building of reserves or an endowment. And those are really the key principles. So I'll just go over them very carefully. Number one, your paper trail, good financial management. Your budgeting, that your overheads and your core costs are included in your program and project budgets. That you have a diversity of income, not only diversity of donors, but different ways of generating income. And that you plan for the future. And I'm going to ask Gaby to talk about that. Okay.
Yeah. I think the key thing for me about budgeting for sustainability and about longer term planning is that being able to build a reserve or an endowment for an organization is based on exactly Sheila's sort of rule one, which is every project pays its way. That in itself is a strategy around being able to build a reserve so that you're not constantly kind of hanging by your fingernails to be able to cover the electricity and the water and so on. Building a reserve and building an endowment are often seem to be used as interchangeable terms, and in fact it's in their purpose that they are quite different. A reserve generally refers to a cash surplus, and it's quite within the sort of legal framework or within the law for a non-profit to build a surplus. The real difference between having the surplus and putting it into a reserve and building an endowment is that an endowment it's a pot of capital that ideally you don't ever touch. You might use the interest, you might use whatever is derived from that capital. You may put it back into the endowment, or you may be able to use some of it and use it for expenses. So the reserve is a matter of slowly building up surplus and adding into that every year. Through careful financial management on Inyathelo's part, we have built a fairly healthy reserve. We aren't yet at endowment. We wouldn't call it an endowment. And there are, I think, really three questions that an organisation, certainly the governing body with the director, would need to ask itself in setting up a reserve. And the first question is that what would the purpose of that reserve be? Are you building it because having a reserve is nice? Is it for sort of cash-strapped emergencies? Is it specifically for building maintenance? Is there a main goal? Is it because you are looking to employ more staff in the future and you're hoping to use a reserve for that? Each board and with the director would need to kind of be very clear about what the goal is. One of the questions that comes up quite often is, what is a reasonable amount for a reserve? And some people sort of go with 12 months worth of operating costs. Other people say 2 years is better. Some people say no, they're just targeting for 6 months. I think it really is kind of up to each organisation and what you're able to manage. So one also doesn't want to set this massive target and then just be completely put off by the enormity of it. On the kind of practicalities of actually building a reserve, Shelagh referenced the sort of undesignated income, and there are various, I suppose, routes that comes into an organisation. One is through generating fees. There are VAT returns that tax-exempt non-profits would be eligible for. If you're paying VAT, you are eligible for VAT returns. You may be able to put into the reserve as a surplus some of the admin fees that Shelagh was talking about earlier. And then if you're lucky enough, donors will give you unrestricted funding. It's increasingly rare these days. And if any of you ever have a donor who offers you endowment funding, just say yes. There's no real reason to say no. I don't know of many organisations that have been that lucky. I think just on the sort of building up a reserve, there are some basic kind of rules. And firstly, I suppose it's a long-term view. This can't happen overnight. We've built up a reserve literally from the first day Inyathelo opened. So it's just year by year, careful financial management. We don't spend if we don't have. Every program sort of pays its way, just little by little accruing surplus, which is what the reserve is. Building a reserve really takes discipline in an organisation. It's financial discipline, it's programming discipline. There's such a pull towards saying, well, I'm sure we can afford that because we have a bit of extra in the bank, and if we just, I'm sure we can make it up. And I think one of the disciplines in an organisation is that if you are going to do that, you'd need to be really clear about the value that spending that money was going to bring to delivering on your objectives or making the intended impact. I think the questions that organisations need to ask themselves and need to be able to answer is, and these are all strategy questions that perhaps a director might discuss with his or her staff, or you would certainly discuss at the board. Are we going to accrue a reserve? If we are going to accrue a reserve, are we going to set a target, or are we going to literally do it step by step in a not an ad hoc way, but we're going to work on whatever is actually surplus at the end of the year. What kind of levels of reserve are we looking for to guard against emergencies? Again, what is the policy? How will we explain to donors? Donors are still, along with we don't do core costs, donors still have I'm generalizing obviously, but still have this approach to reserves of, oh, obviously don't need our money, because there's, so there's the sense that donors are doing emergency funding or desperation funding. If you're not in need of the money because you've got this reserve, then we only fund desperate organizations. Feels like what they're actually saying. And that's obviously also problematic. We talk quite a lot about the kind of donor education that actually needs to happen, and that it's our responsibility as organizations to engage donors in exactly those discussions. There's been a fairly big campaign, I think since about 2010. I don't know how many of you have heard of Dan Pallotta, talking about overheads and the place that they kind of occupy in an organization, and the fact that this isn't additional or add-on or a nice to have. This is what makes an organization run. An endowment, you can either build a reserve towards creating an endowment. It would need to be, the idea of an endowment is that it's sufficient capital to be able to use the interest generated for something useful. So either you're going to be covering salaries with the interest, or you're going to be running a particular program or so on. That's the idea of an endowment. A reserve literally is seen there as sort of surplus reserve funding. You keep it in reserve should it be needed for a strategic expenditure.
How do you invest it? Because you can get high interest-bearing accounts for cash, but you'll get to a point where you have to ask yourselves, is there wiser ways of investing this money? And that's when you can approach fund management experts to look at equities, bonds, property, and those kind of things. Because over time, that pot of money will grow more if you put it in equities. But the amount of money you generate annually becomes less. So it depends on how dependent you are on that money for the income you get. Because if it's just cash, you will get a percentage of interest. When it's in equities, you will get dividends, but they're generally lower than the interest you get from cash. But the principal amount is going to grow because shares go up usually, unless you've bought some duds. So those kind of things start coming into the question when you've got larger amounts. And if you endow, an endowment is really something you can't touch. And when you make the decision to have an endowment, it really means that you envisage your organization surviving for another 50 years. That's when it becomes an institution. So you have to ask yourself, do we have that kind of longevity, or do we keep this money so that it's accessible for now? And I think one of the other wonderful things about having reserves is it gives you flexibility. We all work in a society that's changing very, very fast. And yes, we might have funding from a particular donor to deliver on a particular issue or program. But something always comes up and you kind of feel we should be involved with that, but there's no resources. And having those reserves enables you to be flexible, to be well positioned in your community to deal with things that come up because the world is changing so fast. And one of the strategic decisions we made last year is we are going to be moving into a big new hub, we're going to call it. Inyathelo started to look at how will we function in that hub. And so we paid out of our reserves a change management person to help us with those questions. If we'd had no reserve, there just wouldn't have been the capacity to do that. So I think that having that reserve really gives you the flexibility to just to be able to do those extra things that you really need to do, but they don't fit into any program.
Thank you for sacrificing your time, Shelagh and Gaby, for sharing your knowledge with us. I'm sure all of us have learned much from your experience.
We've got a booklet.